Horror fans, welcome back. This is the Indian movie critic and let's continue with the Indian horror movie tier list. This is part 2 and I guess we don't have to go through the lengthy preamble again like part 1 now, do we? Anyway, here is the short version. I'll be watching all the Indian horror movies recommended by you folk. I don't care about the language, the budget, the popularity, when or where it was screened. I am looking at everything and I'll be putting them into a tier list and not some boring tier list with some arbitrary SABC 1 2 3 categories or some mid-tier 7 out of 10 categories where people will dump all the films that they are not sure about. No, here at the Indian Movie Critic, we like to keep things more interesting. So here are the tiers. Peak, the absolute pinnacle of Indian horror. Glorious, almost peak but held back by flaws. Underrated, deserved way more love than they got. Overrated, overhyped, underwhelming. Yes, a lot of hot takes incoming. Nope, I watched this film so that you don't have to. Avoid at all costs. In part 1, we covered 13B, Fear Has a New Address, Manichitrathadu, Sumati Valavu, Darna Manahe, Demonte Colony and Desire. Perhaps after this video is done, you can go back and watch part now. But now, without any further ado, let's begin part 2 of the Indian horror movie tier list, starting with... Let me just set the stage for the next film on our tier list because it's a bit of a difficult one to talk about. See, within the opening minutes of this film, we are introduced to the protagonist's grandmother. She is extremely old, she is semi-paralyzed, she is weak and even incapacitated to the point that she can't even call for help. And this isn't a spoiler, but she dies, or more likely was killed in the middle of the night right at the opening of the film, seemingly at the hands of the supernatural entities that you learn are haunting this family and their home for quite some time. Yeah, let's just sit with that for a second. This was a woman who couldn't move, who couldn't scream, who couldn't even ask for help, and every single night she was tormented by otherworldly entities like some kind of recurring sleep paralysis demon until she was quite literally scared to death. So no, this is not a fun movie. Let's talk about Bhoothakalam. A bit of a preamble and a word of warning just so we are all on the same page here. The trailer of this film is not very much representative of the actual film, as in the trailer makes it seem like some kind of horror thriller where our leading lady traps her son in their home or something, but that is not what the movie is about. No idea why they cut the trailer in such a bait and switch manner, but I thought it would be best to inform you in advance. So, what is the film about then? Is it just another haunted house film? Well, we'll get into all of that in a second. There is a lot to unpack here. Now, the title of the film might sound a bit corny and comedic as it literally translates to the past, and more importantly is a play on the words booth and kalam, ghost time. Haha, I see what you did there, filmmakers. Very funny, very clever. But this movie ironically might just be one of the most poignant, melancholic, thematically dense, and simply put, one of the most important films on this tier list so far, and maybe in all of Indian horror media. Why do I say that? But before that, here is the plot synopsis. Bhoothakalam tells the tale of Asha, an aging and psychologically scarred widow, and her inept and ineffectual son Vinu, who, after the death of Asha's aging mother, experience some strange and disturbing happenings in their home. I'm gonna keep the actual story and plot details vague as this is one of those films that is best experienced firsthand. So from here on out, don't expect me to talk much about the actual plot of the film. I'll just leave you with this. To paraphrase one of the characters of the film, apart from us, there seems to be no one else here. But if you look closely, you'll see someone else here as well. That did sound spooky, yes, but it did sound a lot like 100 other haunted house horror films now, didn't it? And that is exactly what the filmmaker Rahul Sadasivan wants you to believe as he welcomes you into the world of Bhoothakalam. Rahul Sadasivan, for the unfamiliar, is the creative genius behind last year's Desire from part 1 of my tier list, which was one of the most fun yet intense popcorn horror films in Indian cinema, and I squarely put it in the glorious tier where it rightfully belongs. Meanwhile, Bhoothakalam is straight 180 from the thrills and excitement of Desire. To put it bluntly, it is not a very fun time, and that is by design. If I were to be more blunt about it, Bhoothakalam is barely a horror film. It is more of a tragic drama about the human condition explored through the lens of a horror film. Okay, that sounded a bit pretentious. Let me put it this way. Bhoothakalam is to horror films what The Dark Knight is to superhero films. Oh, that was a hot take, I know that. But I am firmly of the opinion that The Batman 2019 by Matt Reeves is a better Batman film than The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight may be an objectively better film, but it is not a good Batman film or even a good comic book film. You see, in The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan hijacked the medium of comic book film adaptations to explore more grandiose themes such as morality, justice, anarchy, order, chaos, and such. Similarly, Rahul Sadasivan has used the medium of horror films to explore heavy subject matters such as grief, trauma, depression, familial bonds, motherhood, addiction, loneliness, faith, trust, mental illness. Oh, it's heavy on themes, alright. My point is, if you go into this horror film expecting scares, surely you will get it. They are peppered quite liberally throughout the entire movie, and especially in the last 20 minutes, which I admit are a masterclass in effective horror filmmaking. But unless you are in the mood for some real, intense, raw human drama for the majority of the runtime that forces you to confront some really heavy subject matters, you will be disappointed and more likely pissed off. And this kind of contributes to the polarizing reception of the film. Ask any film critic and they'll tell you it's one of the most important Indian horror films ever made. But ask a casual normie film goer and they will probably tell you it was a waste of their time. Either way, don't expect any lukewarm responses. Does this make Bhoothakalam a bad horror film in terms of scares per minute? Maybe. But Heath Ledger barely had 30 minutes of screen time in The Dark Knight and is still considered to be one of the best Joker performances ever. Okay, bad analogy aside, I guess what I'm trying to say is this. I think it's a bit of an injustice to talk about the horror of a horror film purely in terms of its screen time alone, especially films like Bhoothakalam, considering how masterfully the film has executed its horror, no matter how limited it may be. For starters, there are no jump scares. Secondly, the atmosphere of the film is tightly crafted. There is this looming sense of dread, as if something will go wrong very soon, even during the lighter and dramatic non-horror moments of the film, and the sense of dread rises progressively as the horror segments of the film ramp up in intensity and frequency, and finally culminates in this epic 20-minute sequence at the end, which is a case study in effective horror filmmaking, to say the least. So kudos to Rahul Sadasivan for his mastery of the craft. Also major kudos to the audio engineers and the sound design team. This film has a gloriously immersive soundscape, especially in its nighttime sequences. And outside of all the technical aspects, major praise to the leads played by Shane Nigam and Revati, who have completely transformed into their respective roles. Revati especially to the extent that it won her a Best Actress award at the Kerala State Film Awards, which is more than deserved if you ask me. Okay, finally, where would we put it in this tier list? A bit confusing. Personally, I believe it's Rahul Sadasivan's best work so far, and I don't want to get into it, but I do have personal reasons for loving this film as well. But as it stands, and objectively speaking, it is a very polarizing film, which despite its less than stellar reputation as a pure horror film, is amazing in its own way. This is a movie that took huge risks, knowing full well it would alienate a lot of people in order to deliver a very unique horror experience, and it does deliver 100% on that front alone. And the logical result of that is somewhat of a niche film that is not exactly the most popular horror film around, but it is a special film regardless. And for these reasons, I'm gonna put it firmly in the underrated tier. It's not everyone's cup of tea, and I definitely understand if you do not like it, but I do believe that this film deserves its fair shake and might just be one of the most important horror films to come out of India, because it didn't just have the courage to tackle heavy subject matters, it had the restraint, the sensitivity and the craft to pull it off brilliantly. So if you are a fan of horror, you owe it to yourself to watch Bhoothakalam as soon as possible. Now to the next movie in our tier list. Raat is a masterpiece, a horror classic, a pioneer of Indian horror cinema, or so they say. In my case, I almost fell asleep watching Raat. Yeah, this is going to be one of those hot takes, so strap yourself in. Raat is one of the most consistently recommended films for this tier list, and without a doubt one of the most celebrated and revered films in the genre of Indian horror. It was directed by the OG Ram Gopal Varma during his breakout years and was released in 1992 simultaneously in both the Hindi and Telugu languages, surprisingly enough. And as opposed to popular films that were genre hybrids that considered horror only as an afterthought, or worse, hijack some other genres as a means to deliver its horror, Raat stands tall and proud as a undiluted, pure, unadulterated, unapologetic horror experience, and for that alone I commend the film. In many ways, it is a pioneer of the Indian horror genre, at least in terms of mainstream cinema, and this tier list wouldn't even exist without Raat. So thanks, Raat. That being said, let me just rip the band-aid right now and say it. I did not like Raat. However, the problem isn't the horror of Raat. The problem is everything in between. Why? Let's get into that. See, Raat has its moments. There are scenes in the film when it's firing on all cylinders and you're in absolute awe and glued to the screen on the edge of your seat. But the downtime between these horror sequences are a meandering snooze fest featuring boring characters, boring drama, zero humor, zero anything of substance until things finally pick up in the last 30 minutes or so. But by then, it's too late and you have checked out, and you're most likely asleep as well, and the filmmakers seem to realize this as well, and they pack up the mystery in a minute or so, and then the film ends shortly thereafter. I know what at least some of you are thinking, that this is a problem with my ADHD addled brain being spoiled by reels and TikToks, being unable to comprehend slow burn cinema without quips and humor every minute or so. No, I disagree. I just talked about another Revati starrer, Bhoothakalam, which was barely a horror film, but the human drama, the characters, and the themes of the film were engrossing to the point that even if the horror of the film was executed horribly, which is not the case, I would still sing praises about the film. Or maybe I am expecting too much from a film made in 1993. Not the case either. I ranked Manichitrathazhu, released a year after Raat, in part 1 of my tier list in the peak tier. See, that is a movie that holds up even today. So much so that even after 3 decades after its release, we are still getting remakes. All the top rated films in my tier list are in Malayalam. Could this just be me being preferential to Malayalam cinema because I am a Malayali myself? Once again, referring back to part 1 of my tier list, Sumathi Valavu is the only film so far that has received the shameful no pranking from me till date. So let's not pull the linguistic chauvinism card now, shall we? But I digress. Let's get back to that. Plot synopsis. Minnie, a college student, and her family, the Sharmas, move into their new home only to have a supernatural entity that haunts the home slowly take over Minnie and destroy her and her family in the process. I would like to say that this is nothing groundbreaking, but that would be literally incorrect, as Raat is often touted as one of the first mainstream Indian horror movies. So yeah, it was groundbreaking, at least for its time. Let's start with the positives. The horror sequences in Raat, when they actually do happen, are glorious to behold. And it's not some mindless sequence of silly jump scares either. These are well directed, well shot, well edited sequences brimming with tension, anxiety, and apprehension, usually climaxing in some sort of grand crescendo. Despite being your typical haunted house film, the horror of the film always remains fresh as well, with these sequences transpiring in ways and settings that are quite different from what the premise might imply. And some of this horror is even unique and relevant to this day. There is this sequence in an empty movie theater strangely capturing the essence of the liminal horror niche, even 30 years before it gained some semblance of popularity. And the opening scene of Minnie being trapped in a town being chased by an unknown entity. There is something so visceral and frightening about this primal experience, almost like a nightmare that has happened to us at some point of time, which Ram Gopal Varma has managed to capture so effectively. And speaking of capturing effectively, the movie is shot with a certain sense of dynamism that is not even seen in modern cinema. There are a ton of steadicam shots putting you effectively in the perspective of the entity hunting down our protagonist, and there are always reaction shots but never any reverse shots, further enhancing the horror of the unseeable and unknowable entity. There are also the seemingly handheld shots, one-earth, Dutch angles, along with some good practical effects shots and one particular VFX shot towards the end that combines practical effects with its VFX. Doing all of this for a simple horror movie would be considered a bit too much even now, but they did it in 1992 and managed to pull off most of it. And the technical brilliance doesn't quite end there with the visuals alone. It extends with the audio as well, with some harsh but effective sound effects and some expertly crafted soundscape featuring minimalistic ambient music for most of the film, creating this morbidly realistic atmosphere of dread. But the real star of the show is not just the technical aspects of the film, but the actual stars of the show, the performances that truly elevate the film, especially Revati as the leading lady Minnie, who switches between friendly neighborhood college girl and a horrifying victim of demonic possession effortlessly in a blink of an eye. And just like Shobana and Manichitrathazhu, her performance is so natural and realistic without even a hint of melodrama or overacting during these sequences that it's almost scary to believe that it is the same actor who is pulling off both the roles. And let's not forget other films of its ilk, especially something like The Exorcist, which the film is liberally borrowing from, used extensive prosthetics and makeup to make the demonic presence seem real. Here all Revati needed were some contact lenses. It's one of the most realistic representations of demonic possessions on screen even today, in my opinion, chiefly thanks to how understated, subtle and minimal it is in its presentation. No bodily fluids or contortions jumping around on the walls or ceiling or anything, just a performance which is so creepy and unnerving that it slides into the realm of supernatural with minimum flashiness. Oh, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there are no flashy, exciting sequences in this film. This film has one of the best neck-snapping sequences put in Indian cinema, but I think it's best experienced firsthand, so I won't spoil anything for you. And it's not just Revati's performance that makes this film great. All the supporting characters do excellent work as well, especially with a short but exceptionally memorable performance by the man, the myth, the legend, Om Puri towards the end of the film. That's a lot of positive. So Why the long face then? Well, for starters, and let's be real, this is not a very original film now, is it? Audiences at that time, except maybe not the cinephiles, would have been lost on how the film borrows from films like The Exorcist, Pet Sematary, etc. But as of now, in the post-internet phase, it's pretty obvious that RGV is not exactly the most original filmmaker around. You know what? I can let that slide. Regardless of how original the film might be, the horror when it hits, it does hit, as I explained. And yeah, that's the thing, when it hits. See, if you ask me, the biggest problem with the film is the downtime between the horror sequences, especially in the first half. Almost nothing of interest happens between the scares. The characters go around doing boring shit. They go to college, they go for ice cream, they go to a park. Sure, at least some of these are setups to horror sequences, but my god, they didn't have to be this boring and padded out. Obviously, I'm not asking for a relentless sequence of scares that would take away from the experience by making us numb to the horror, but what I am asking for is anything compelling between the scares. And like I mentioned earlier, I actually commend the film for playing it straight and being devoid of humor or quips that could take away from the horror vibes, but there should be some form of interesting drama to keep me engaged. Case in point, there is this entire sequence of Minnie and her boyfriend going to the park to celebrate his birthday, and it's just scenes of them on the bike commuting, sitting in the park, having ice cream. I didn't need to see any of this. In fact, a whole lot of this pointless and needless padding could have been cut out and the film would have been better for it. I'm sure of the fact that the film had a much longer and much padded out original cut which they had to trim out to a reasonable time, but in this process they might have butchered the edit, and as a result we get a movie where the first half is padded out to oblivion. Meanwhile, the second half and especially the last 30 minutes of the movie seem rushed and cluttered. We'll get to the second half in a bit, don't you worry about that, but this raises a question. Why didn't I make the same fuss for movies like Bhoothakalam or Manchitharu, where the horror barely rears its head until it's the second half? Well, that's because these films were damn entertaining even despite the horror. Entertaining things happen in these films even in its downtime. It's not like the characters are going about their daily life doing boring stuff. But yeah, that being said, here's the contradiction even with that statement. I could watch the characters of Manchitharu, Bhoothakalam, Thumbad, Aamis, The Wailing, Norai or any of the other favorite films just stand in a blank room and have a conversation simply because they are interesting characters to begin with. The lead Minnie from Raat is not an interesting character one bit. She feels like a side character in her own film. She is charming like most attractive women of her age, but beyond that there is nothing to her. Ask me about any of the leads of other horror films I mentioned and I can write a mini essay about them, but with Minnie all I can say is she is just a generic young woman. Fine, she's not an interesting character. There are a lot of horror films where the lead character is not the most interesting person in the world and almost a blank slate. But in these films, the leads are put in interesting situations to begin with, not just going out and having ice cream for 10 minutes. This is also not helped by the performance of Revati as well. Wait, how does that work out when I praised the demonic performance for 2 minutes previously? You see, dear viewer, unlike most horror films with a demonic lead, where the performance is ruined due to overacting from the demonic side of the character, strangely enough here the character is somewhat ruined because Minnie, pre-demonic possession, while likable, borders on cringe and melodramatic. As is typical with Bollywood leading lady performances at the time, she is too animated and cutesy for this movie. And the blame is not on Revati. This was clearly a directorial choice to enhance the distinction between the demonic and non-demonic performances, but as it stands, it went a bit overboard in my opinion and ruins the character of Minnie. And speaking of characters, the rest of the characters of the film, the Sharmas and Minnie's friend circle, despite being delivered with nuanced performances by good actors at the helm, are not even remotely remarkable. And that is until we get to the last 20 minutes. We are introduced to the character of Tantrik, who is probably one of the most enigmatic and simultaneously charismatic characters in the film. But unfortunately, the film screws up this character as well for absolutely no reason, as he gets barely any screen time to fully shine thanks to the film rushing to a conclusion by the last 20 minutes. Looking at something like The Exorcist or Manchitharu, the problem solver character Father Merrin or Dr. Sunny arrives at almost the halfway mark of the film. The film knows they are the most compelling characters in the script and treats them with the gravitas and importance that they deserve, but in Raat the audience barely gets to experience 15 minutes of Om Puri's aura while we spend ample time with the vanilla girl as she hangs out at her her friend's place. God, this pisses me off. Not only is this character rush, the story behind the actual entity, as well as some other cool stuff like the whole underground section of the home, the weird one-eyed guy, all of these are glossed over. So much wasted potential. You know what? Just thinking of the mistakes and the wasted potential of this film gets me pissed off. What makes me more pissed off is how thoroughly this film came in recommended to me, only to leave me disappointed by an equally thorough degree. Raat may be important, Raat may be influential, Raat is technically impressive as well, especially for his time, but great, not for me. Overrated tier. Now hold on to your pitchforks for a second. All that being said, Raat, despite its negatives, is still a very unique horror experience. Unlike most modern horror cinema, it is not trying to keep you on your tippy toes non-stop and presents you with the most normal, borderline boring family in cinema encountering something paranormal, and you are a witness and a bystander as it unfolds, no matter how much of a drag it is. Take it or leave it. Look, I know the film has its die-hard fan base and this is one of the most recommended films on this list, but I am not one of the fans and I am not recommending this film. Watch the film if you must. It's an important milestone for Indian horror cinema, but according to me, it does not hold up, as some may have falsely recommended, blinded by their nostalgia and rosy retrospection. I know a lot of you would rightfully disagree with me, but I stand by my ranking. If you disagree with anything I have told so far, convince me in the comments. Now on to the next film. Now let's talk about the next movie in our list, Booth. No, not Booth, Phoonk. See, I was originally set to watch Booth, also an RGB flick which came in highly recommended, but some of you all told me not to watch Booth and instead watch Phoonk because unlike Booth, it's not a carbon copy of Raat, but a bit like Raat, but much better. So I did, and congratulations guys, I think I should watch Raat again. Okay, maybe not a reboot or remake of Raat, but Phoonk is more or less a spiritual successor to Raat, as in it repeats more or less the same story beats. There is this idyllic upper middle class family living a seemingly happy life when something happens and their daughter is taken over by an entity. The parents then resort to science but fail, things get worse, and then ultimately they seek the help of a tantric in the last 30 minutes of the movie or so, and then some crazy shenanigans take place, ultimately saving the daughter. Cue happy ending. A plot synopsis is almost redundant at this point, so let me just tell you how I feel about the film. Now, I personally believe that every film needs to be judged based on its own merits and demerits, and not how I, a random online film critic with almost zero filmmaking experience, would have done something different. But I think it's more than fair to benchmark the film against other films in the genre, like I do it all the time. But with this film specifically, I think it would be pretty fun to compare and contrast it against Raat directly, as it basically follows more or less the same plot trajectory and is by the same filmmaker as well, albeit with some changes, for better or worse. So let's do that. In a nutshell, Phoonk fixes everything that made Raat exhausting, but then completely fumbles what made Raat memorable in the first place. For starters, the pacing of the movie is much better than Raat, primarily due to it being 20 minutes shorter than Raat, which may not seem like much, but I'm pretty sure if Raat had taken 20 minutes off by shaving down on the boring bits from the slow as first half, I would not be whining that much about that. But the pacing wins not only because of a shorter, leaner runtime, but also because of what actually happens in that time as well. See, unlike something like Raat, there are no boring sequences in Phoonk. Everything exists to create meaningful drama and to move the plot forward, so much so that I hesitate to call the time between the horror sequences in Phoonk downtime in any meaningful way. I mean, the first horror sequence in Phoonk actually happens only around the 40-minute mark into the movie, but I was not even remotely bored till then. Meanwhile, I was waiting for someone to put me out of my misery while forcing myself through the NAP certified non-horror sequences in Raat, which were almost pointless and exist only to act as a bridge between the horror sequences. And it's not just the drama and the plot. Another factor that made Raat a sludge to get through was the fact that the lead characters inhabiting Raat had the personality of plain oatmeal and felt like NPCs in their own film or game or whatever. This is not the case with Phoonk, where our leading character Rajiv has an actual personality with well-defined character traits, chiefly the fact that he's an atheist and a really proud one at that, who has his philosophical underpinnings challenged when supernatural events start occurring at his own home. I mean, how's that for drama? And Rajiv is brought to life by the Kannada actor Sudeep, who has more than enough charisma to carry the entire film. But that won't be necessary, as we have a glorious antagonist in the form of Madhu, played by Ashwini Kaleskar, who delivers a campy, over-the-top and thoroughly entertaining performance. She's a joy to watch every time she's on screen, and despite her shorter screen time, gets enough opportunity to more than be a glorified cameo, unlike Om Puri in Raat. Not saying that the cast in Raat did a bad job, but like I said in my Raat video, excellent performances all around from Revati when she's taken over by the entity. But outside of that, the characters were as exciting as blank spreadsheet, with Revati's non-entity character being almost borderline cringe in her vanilla neighborhood girl role. So to summarize Phoonk, unlike Raat, it has interesting charismatic characters, including a well-defined antagonist who are given enough screen time to shine and be themselves. This combined with the shorter runtime and engaging drama courtesy of the characters and their moral and philosophical conflicts contribute to a certain thematic weight to a film, as well as making it so much better than Raat on these respects, ultimately leading to a film that is simply put fun, which is not exactly how I would describe a film like Raat. And by the way, before I go any further, if you have seen both films, tell me right now, which one scared you or which one did you actually like? Drop it in the comments. Now come closer for a bit. Let me deliver the plot twist a little earlier because you're very special to me. I would rank this film on the same overrated tier as Raat. Whoa. Why such a low rating after so much praise? Well, that is because despite all of its negatives and its overrated tier ranking, Raat is still a very unique horror experience. Like I said many times in my tier listing of Raat, when the horror hits, it hits despite the snoozeworthy downtime and the NPC characters and the atrocious pacing. Maybe that's why it is still beloved to this day, even if I myself and others might find it not so scary and not worth your time. Meanwhile, Phoonk with all its positives is a blast while it lasts, but there is nothing to make it stand out from all the contemporaries and is ultimately a forgettable film despite a fun time. And there are some other definite negatives to Phoonk as well that drag down the experience further. For starters, none of the horror sequences are as unique or as memorable as those in Raat, and I would go as far as to say that the last action horror sequence of the film is straight up schlock, with the lead being thrown into walls like it's some kind of silly Telugu film. Yeah, the finale alone takes away from the gravitas of the film. No, that would be incorrect, I guess. I think the movie started losing its way from the point it introduced the tantric character. Like I said, in closely following with the story beats of Raat, a tantric character is introduced to solve our supernatural headaches, but he's no Ompuri. He's all melodramatic and campy, and not in a strange and creepy way like our antagonist, but more in a overacting, you went full retard sort of way, and feels very out of place, like a clown in a library with his cock out. And once again comes in very late in the film with only 15 minutes left in the runtime, and the film after its introduction transforms into this campy, over-the-top, nonsensical caricature of Raat from that point onwards, which made me exceptionally disappointed considering the point and a serious tone the film had built up so far. Then there is also the fact that it is not exactly great on a technical level as well. Sure, there is this one cool slow zoom in and zoom out sequence, but nothing that carries the steadicam energy of Raat. And in the one sequence where it does do something that captures your attention, camera movement wise at least, it overindulges to a nauseating extent. Also, something unintentionally hilarious that sticks out is that there is this strange filmmaking choice to focus on inanimate objects on screen for absolutely no reason, which is supposed to add to the horror, but it ends up being laughable by the end, which I guess is similar to the weird everyone laughs way too much at the theater scene in Raat. But random movie quirk aside, I guess move on. Anyway, camera work aside, on a technical side, some of the practical and visual effects are done neatly enough, but whatever effects, practical, visual and CG was done for the finale feels cheap and almost laughable. Finally, I don't think it's right to disown child actors, but I'm sorry, the haunted child in this film is nowhere as compelling as Minnie in Raat. Unfair comparison, I know, but I still needed to say that. You know what? Bringing it all together, Phoonk, just like Raat, had all the makings of a peak film, but unlike Raat, which had consistent bad filmmaking decisions throughout, which made the film a chore to get through, the flaws of Phoonk, technical or otherwise, could have been ignored as the core premise of an atheist facing an ideological and philosophical battle when his daughter gets possessed is thoroughly compelling and kept me engaged for most of the film's runtime. But ultimately, the film drops its ball in the finale and turns an otherwise poignant film into a campy, nonsensical schlockfest. And for that reason, I'm gonna put Phoonk in the overrated tier. What a shame. Another case of wasted potential. You know what? It is a bit strange that Raat and Phoonk are overrated for different reasons. Raat is like a matcha, intense, divisive, and an acquired taste. Phoonk is a bit like green tea, smooth, inoffensive, and ultimately forgettable. Regardless, both are extremely overrated if what you actually wanted is some really strong tea. That was a horrible analogy. Let's move on to the next film. Have you guys ever watched a film where the film itself is okay or good or meh or even polarizing at best, but performances are so captivating that it will keep you hooked till the end? Phobia is one such film. Plot synopsis: after a certain traumatic event, Mehak, an up-and-coming artist, develops agoraphobia, the fear of the outside world, and is more or less confined to her apartment. But things take a rather horrifying turn when an entity, the former occupant of the said apartment, begins haunting Mehak, putting her in a spot to say the least. Very intriguing premise indeed. Why can't her friends just take her to a different place? Yeah, suspension of disbelief aside, Meg sort of becomes obsessed with why this particular entity is haunting her, and the film turns into a part investigative thriller where Meg tries to piece together the reason for her haunting. Heads up, this is one of the most infuriating horror films that I have ever come across. No spoilers, but the results of Meg's investigation can sort of derail the movie big time for some. It definitely ruins the tone and the atmosphere of an otherwise expertly crafted horror film just to subvert the audience's expectations. Similar to the midway twist of something like my favorite horror film of all time, Lake Mungo. And just like Lake Mungo, it also sort of redeems itself shortly after with even a bigger reveal that saves the film by almost shifting into a completely different genre of horror, so to say. Let me put it in this way. Depending on your tolerance for the weird, the wacky and the absurd, you will either love or hate this film. This film spends an ample amount of time to expertly craft some truly scary horror sequences, leading to a tight, claustrophobic, unnerving and anxiety-inducing atmosphere, but it's bold or even stupid enough to throw them all away in a minute's notice in service of its twists and reveals in sequences that are a tonal whiplash, to say the least. To put it bluntly, the reveals of the film, Mike's investigation and haunting, will leave you pulling your hair and punching the wall if you're not prepared for it. But then you will realize there is around 20 minutes more left in the film after the reveals of the investigation, and the film definitely delivers by the end in ways that you never expected, but the seeds for which were planted earlier if you were paying attention. Now, I for one did not mind the jarring tonal and genre shifts, as what the film does ultimately pays off in rather creative and surprising ways, something I have not seen in other horror films, so points for originality at least. But I cannot speak for others, and those who watched the film with me expecting a traditional by the numbers horror film were not so impressed with the direction that the film went. All that being said, one thing that is not subjective however is, regardless of your opinion about how the film plays out, the fact is that this film is the Radhika Apte show, and her performance will keep you glued to the screen. This is my first time watching a Radhika Apte film, and my have I been missing out. Her performance in this film is an absolute showstopper, and she gives it her 100%. She is exceptionally expressive without ever falling into the overacting territory, and her performance does not feel Bollywoody or cinematic, so to say. It feels almost like you're watching a real person in her day-to-day life, and that, my friends, is one of the biggest compliments I can give to an actor. In fact, I would say that this film is worth watching purely for her performance alone. And you know what, continuing on with the trend of the non-Bollywoodness, this film as a whole does not feel very Bollywood. It feels tighter in scope and scale, being limited to a single apartment, and it feels very down to earth and uncinematic in its presentation. And no, that is not a strike against the film. The whole down to earth acting and presentation, along with a few atypical side characters as well, contribute to a film that feels real and not just realistic, simply put. Now, to bring it all together, this is a very original and polarizing film that plays out in a way that you might not expect or agree with, at least in terms of its tone, and is led by one of the most charismatic, magnetic, yet down-to-earth performances I have ever witnessed in Bollywood. If I speak about this film anymore, I might just end up spoiling the film further, so let me just put it in the glorious tier and move on. Now, for the next film. What if I told you that one of the best horror films to ever come out of India has almost no horror in it at all? When I started the Indian horror movie tier list, I distinctly remember telling that I'm gonna keep the definition of what constitutes a horror movie a bit loose to be more accommodative to all subgenres of horror, and the next movie I'm gonna talk about sort of exemplifies this point. Aamis, or The Ravening in English, is a 2019 Indian Assamese language romantic horror film written and directed by Bhaskar Hazarika. This is the first Assamese film I have ever watched in my life, and having watched this, I definitely want to watch more, especially the director's previous work. Remember when I said that Bhoothakalam was barely a horror film? It's more of a tragic drama about the human condition explored through the lens of a horror film. Yeah, it still sounds pretentious, but moving past that, Aamis goes one step further. Sort of. There is almost zero horror in the traditional sense, so no supernatural entities or sci-fi elements or scary monsters or whatever. It's more of a realistic, grounded, tragic romance drama with some disturbing elements, but the disturbing elements of the film are so messed up that the film gets shot straight into the genre of disturbing horror. I kid you not. this film might cause some of you folks to puke, so best not to watch the film while having lunch. Now, before I begin, I believe that certain films are best experienced without any prior info about what actually even happens in the film, because sometimes that is the filmmaker's intention. Case in point, while I'm writing this, Project Hail Mary was released, and me not having watched the trailers contributed immensely to my enjoyment of the film, as the trailers basically spoiled things that were only supposed to be revealed almost an hour into the film. Same with the case of the only existing trailer for Aamis, which, while it doesn't exactly reveal what's gonna happen, it more or less alludes to the events that will take place later and makes it more than obvious what the entire film is actually about. If you're cool with that, then watch the trailer to get a feel for what you're about to get into, I guess. But like I said, it's best to go in as blank as possible to let the disturbing elements slowly sneak upon you at a pace dictated by the filmmakers. In keeping with that line of thinking, let me just explain very briefly what the film is about without getting into any spoilers, and then you can decide whether it's worth spending 2 hours of your life on this film. Aamis is a tragic romance drama involving Suman, a PhD student, and Nirmali, an older married doctor from the locality, who fall in love with each other, but alas, being bound by their own morals and the shackles of society, they are unwilling to commit to this relationship or take it any further in any meaningful sense, if you know what I'm talking about. However, ultimately, they find a way to enact on their desires via some rather disturbing acts. I will just leave it at that. Look, the movie by the first quarter or so more than hints at where it is actually heading, but I'm pretty sure for those who are not regular enjoyers of the more strange and disturbing subgenres of horror, it would not exactly click that fast, so I'm gonna leave it purposely vague. Now, like I made clear in the opening, this is barely a horror film. In fact, it has more in common with films such as In the Mood for Love, 96, Side B of Satyasagara, Your Name, Decision to Live, and Drive of all things than any horror film. This film is about forbidden love, the longing to connect, and the extent to which one will go to express this love in the face of impossible odds. It presents this very mature and deep idea of romance rather than the typical haha, I like you, let's spark and be done with it, Hollywoodized hedonistic idea of love. And this is helped by the fact that the film is so understated and grounded in its presentation, which contributes to the immersion and realism so much so that at certain point you will feel like you are inhabiting the world of the characters. More than Phobia, which I talked about previously, this film really commits to its indie roots, and there are some really weird and out there scenes and sequences and even filmmaking choices presented that I won't spoil, but are brilliantly executed, to put it simply. And the movie features some completely unknown actors as well that further contributes to this indie vibe and total immersion. I think it's the first feature film for both the leads, but you won't be able to tell that. Argadeep Barua, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, who plays Suman, doesn't even seem like he is acting. He seems to be playing himself, and that's not a shade at his performance. What I'm saying is, his performance is not your traditional refined cinematic or theatre acting or anything. It feels authentic, it feels real. He has his little quirks and unique charm. He's always pleasant and smiling, and simply put, he's very likable. It's not the type of performance you can manufacture for a camera, and I'm glad that they chose him for this role. Same for Leema Das, who plays Nirmali, the doctor. She's also a first-time actress who also happens to be a doctor in real life. She has this definite aura of a very charismatic, capable, and confident older woman, which I believe again is herself in real life. And her performance is very interesting in the sense that you can clearly see how her guards are being slowly pulled down throughout the course of the movie by Suman, and she becomes almost scarily vulnerable by the end. Whether this is thanks to the expert direction to the non-actors or them having a natural aptitude for acting is unclear. Regardless, glorious lead performances. Same for the other minor characters like Jumi, Nirmala's best friend, and Elias Das, Suman's friend or mentor, who seem like very real people. I especially like Elias Da. He's one of those respectable older bros we all have met at some point in our lives. Now, in the hands of other directors, I think this film would have ended up being too boring, appearing to be cheap, or worse, too cinematic and seeming overproduced and unrealistic. But the director Bhaskar Hazarika has made this film with a certain grounded, reserved authenticity and tact, which is to be respected. I mean, the places this film goes and the things that happen by the end, phew, in the hands of typical Bollywood Indian directors, it would be presented as some kind of melodramatic, over-the-top, cheap schlock. But Bhaskar Hazarika has kept it classy. In fact, despite the taboo, disturbing stuff that happens in the film, almost nothing is presented on screen for cheap shock value, and the film sticks to its classiness till the very end. So much so that it feels like a very unique piece of Indian cinema, and I'm very much looking forward to watching his other films. On a technical level as well, the film looks pretty good. good. And like I said, there are some very well produced realistic sequences as well that carry a lot of thematic weight in addition to just looking great. The soundscape is expertly crafted as well, with a very minimal score and scenes playing out in almost total silence for most of the film, with the music only turning up during very vital moments. And when it does turn up, they are pretty unique. There are especially these two unique tracks which are really loud that elevate the film in certain very specific moments. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't spoken literally anything about the actual horror of the film. This is partly to avoid spoilers, but mostly because I don't want you to think that this is a straightforward horror film. See, in all honesty, I can recommend this film only to a very specific horror audience who are also okay with watching a really well-made, slow-burn indie romance drama and not just a straightforward horror film. In fact, the horror in this film is more or less an allegory for the forbidden romance aspect of the film. So, know who you are and approach the film accordingly. All in all, this might be one of the best romance films I have ever seen, despite the disturbing aspects of it. And if I were to rank this film as a whole, I'd put it in the peak tier, right there with the Saptasagara films and 96. But this is a horror tier list. Considering how less of a horror film it is, while also recognizing how unknown the film is, I can only keep it in the underrated tier. To conclude, if you think you are the right audience for Aamis, and you'll know it if you are, go watch the film right now. Just avoid the trailer if you can. I believe it's on Sony Live. And if you have already seen it, drop your reaction in the comments. I want to know whether it clicked for you or not. Lastly, let's talk about the final film in this tier list for now, Welcome Home. You know what? I have already made an entire 20-minute video explaining how this is India's most disturbing film. As mentioned in the video, I do not think that Welcome Home is everyone's cup of tea, and as much as I want to put it in the peak tier for that reason alone, I'm gonna have to bring it down to glorious tier. Okay, that is it, I guess. This took a lot of time. If you're still around, thanks for watching so far. I will break up this video into smaller chunks and re-upload for those who don't want to spend so much time watching a single video and who wants more bite-sized pieces. Anyway, until the next one, this is the Indian Movie Critic. Bye.